Given that MIT still exists in the world in a physical place, I want to begin, as is now our practice, by saying that MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Good evening. Welcome everyone to the Department of Architecture's Spring Lecture Series. My name is Dante Winston. I'm a PhD student in the History, Theory, and Criticism of Art and Architecture Discipline Group, or HTC. My HTC Forum co-chair, Hampton Smith, and I are thrilled to have you join us for today's event with Professor Arabindan-Kesson. Her talk tonight, titled Vision and Value, Cotton and the Material Race. This lecture is part of the HTC Forum lecture series, which is an opportunity for the doctoral students within HTC to invite scholars whose work we find intellectually compelling. Scholars who are shaping the field, instigating critical conversations, and with whom we are engaged in our coursework and our research. Tonight's lecturer meets all of those criteria. Professor Kessen is an assistant professor of Black Diasporic art with a joint appointment in the departments of African American Studies and Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. Her research and teaching focuses on Black diaspora and British art, with an emphasis on histories of race, empire, and medicine. A native of Sri Lanka, Professor Kessen has lived and trained across the world, from Australia and New Zealand, where she trained and worked as a registered nurse, then on to the United Kingdom and Ghana. She later transitioned to a career in the humanities, completing her PhD in African American Studies and Art History at Yale University. At Princeton, Professor Kessen teaches interdisciplinary courses, though a common thread is found in each. A thread that centers on the study of art and material culture and focuses on the social and historical networks in which they are embedded. Each course challenges students to explore the ways in which visual culture shapes ideologies of race, and also challenges them to come to understand the powerful and significance of art in the Black diaspora. Her recently published book, Black Bodies, White Gold, Art, Cotton, and Commerce in the Atlantic World, of which tonight's talk draws, uses cotton and commodity, central to the slave trade and colonialism, as a focus for new interpretations of the way art, commerce, and colonialism were intertwined in the 19th century Atlantic world. It traces the emergence of a speculative vision that informs perception of Blackness, in which artistic renderings of cotton as both a commodity and material became inexorably tied to the monetary value of Black bodies. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Anna Arabindan-Kesson.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you, Dante, for that really lovely introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today in conversation with you all. I also want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the unceded lands of the Elap, the Pinjarap, and the Wadandi Noongar. I want to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future. And I'd like to acknowledge all First Nations people who are present with us today. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm just going to share my screen and then we can begin the talk. So I want to, as Dante said, this talk is drawn from my book, which I'm happy to have behind me for the first time in a talk. So this is exciting. And I want to start my talk with an anecdote that you may have already heard of in the news. These are images of Hopper College, which is a residential college at Yale University. And it was very recently named Calhoun after the 19th century politician and advocate of slavery. In 2016, one of the dining hall staff stood on top of a table and with his broomstick, he broke a stained glass window that showed two African-American enslaved people, a man and a woman, both with large cotton baskets on their head, standing amidst rows of cotton. The figures look as if they're in a garden. They're neatly dressed, and the cotton is barely knee-height. Behind them, in the distance, tall trees shade a plantation manor. It's one of those ubiquitous plantation scenes that have circulated throughout the history of the United States. This window transformed the vicious brutality of chattel slavery into an ornamental motif in which enslaved workers become decorative tropes. Now, I sat and ate in that dining room many times while I was a graduate student at Yale, as I was affiliated with the college, but I never really noticed this window. So when I read about Corey Menifee's act of civil protest, I was both surprised at my own ignorance and impressed by his courage. Initially charged for reckless endangerment and criminal mischief, Menifee resigned from his job, but was later reinstated. His act of civil protest really exemplifies the deeply symbolic nature of cotton in the social imaginary of the United States. It's a symbolism that calls to mind, literally visualizes, the deeply troubling yet fundamental histories of exploitation that birthed that nation. But it was his explanation of his actions that really stuck with me, as he explained in a news interview, and I'm quoting here, "No employee should be subject to coming to work and seeing slave portraits on a daily basis," end quote. I think Menifee's comments make a really crucial connection between what we see, how we see, and it's a connection that he shows has a powerful material impact on the conditions within which people live, work, and act. So in this talk today, I'll be exploring this connection between the material and symbolic meanings of cotton. I'll be focusing on the ways cotton has been represented and used in American art more broadly, and I'll do so from a very particular viewpoint, one that artists have created for us. In 1992, the African-American artist Leonardo Drew created this work, Untitled Number 25, which is a sculpture made of cotton. The work illustrates some well-worn dualisms in art history. It is highly abstract in its gridded and minimalist form, yet it's evocatively material. It is intensely haptic, asking to be touched, yet frustratingly, and if you've seen it and walked around it, I think this is probably something you'll have noticed too. Frustratingly, its layers and layers of cotton obscure our vision. Repeating the shape of the cotton bale, this work is both handmade and industrial. It's both raw material and finished product. It's both commodity and art object. Drew's material insistence extends beyond cotton. In other works, he uses detritus such as rust and paper, wires, to explore the beauty of waste and decay and the aesthetic possibilities of industrial material. Recalling the formal explorations of artists like Jackson Pollock, Eva Hesse, and the Arte Povera group, he developed his craft in the late 80s and early 90s. His abstract sculptural language, with its material insistence and refusal of the figure, seems directly opposed to the striking and alluring photographs of an artist like Hank Willis Thomas. Thomas' photographs, drawn from archives across the world, explore genealogies of visual culture, using the mechanics of the photograph as a reproducible mode of vision and a circulating commodity. Thomas deconstructs the chains of signification embedded in these circulating genres of representation across time and space. Both artists use cotton differently, but yet both artists are nevertheless fundamentally concerned with its relationship, with the relationship it evokes between meaning and materiality. Drew's post-minimalist aesthetics and Thomas's spectacular surfaces draw our attention to the organic and ideological meanings that materials hold within them, both visible and invisible. Or as Drew explained, and I'm quoting directly here from him, cotton is a material with memory. It has a history. It is not something that is picked up at random. It is something that has a life of its own. So what is this life, this history, this memory of cotton, and what does it allow us to see? 19th century American consumers understood the significance of cotton in this way too. Its symbolic meaning was expressed in very material ways. The progress of cotton, for example, materialized progress itself. As a circulating commodity, cotton became the symbol of the expanding networks of global capitalism, helped along by colonialism and sustained by the transatlantic slave trade. It was variously described as a thread that bound, a fiber that connected, a textile that clothed the world. Merging plantations and factories into a global industrial complex, as you can see in these lithographs that I've put on the screen. Cotton also offered a discursive means of expressing national identity. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, and Luther Terry illustrates, cotton thread holds the Union together. The world of connection that cotton opened up remains an important framework for scholars today too. Across disciplines, the forms of cotton circulation provide a framework for tracing, uncovering, and mapping historical experiences, understandings, and expressions of a global imaginary. There is a paradox here, of course, because in cotton's movement from place to place and in its transformation from raw material to cloth, this process depended on the means of abstraction. What traders and buyers were ultimately looking for in cotton as a finished product was the absence of any handwork or any trace of labor. So while historically cotton might have materialized the intersections of the local and the global, it also covered over the human dimensions of labor and its experience. This paradox is the starting point for the 2017 Turner Prize winner Lubaina Hamid's abstracted schema in this piece, Cotton.com, which was first shown in 2002. It's been displayed more recently, I think it was 2019 in Nottingham, but these are photographs from the 2002 installation. As you can see here, the work was arranged in an expanded grid that consisted of small black and white patterned canvases that faced a brass plaque on the wall opposite. The brass plaque reads, "He said I look like a painting by Murillo as I carried water for the hogang, just because I balanced the bucket on my head." The cotton canvases, painted with a large variation of patterns in black and white, are like a series of communications, as the digital title suggests, referring in part to the passage of letters across the Atlantic from radical Manchester factory operatives who supported Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Hamid has also described in interviews how she imagines the ways these factory operatives and enslaved people in the South might have themselves imagined correspondences with each other through the movement of cotton, the way things might have been caught in its fiber as it traveled from the plantation to the factory. Each canvas then symbolizes one moment of this imagined correspondence, recreating a space of dialogue and convergence for these unseen bodies on whose labor the connection between plantation and factories hinged. Collapsing the space between plantation and factory that Luther Terry depicted in his rather strange painting. I'll just put that up again. Hamid highlights the convergences of labor, white and black, that are embedded in the trade. So in working through the ways cotton connected different people and places, this idea of convergences or entanglements that has provided me with a useful way of stopping and looking more closely at the material implications of these networks. So if we return to the text in Hamid's work, I'll want to sort of expand this idea a little more. This quote comes from a travel account written by Frederick Law Olmsted, who I'm sure you're all aware of, who traveled through the southern plantations in the 1850s and early 60s. So Olmsted here is referring to the idealized paintings of Spanish painter Esteban Murillo to reinforce the picturesqueness of this female water carrier who worked on the plantation. Because of his expressive style, in the 19th century, Murillo was used as a sort of a code word to express the picture worthiness or the picturesqueness of a person or a scene. So Hamid addresses this interaction from the knowing perspective of the woman, who is describing her experience of being objectified as an aesthetic experience. So she's describing her experience of being turned into a picture. And I think in a way, being turned into a picture or being aestheticized is not too dissimilar to the process of being abstracted out of the picture. It is another way, I think, to consider how materials we use to understand the history of slavery, such as documents, diaries, also occlude aspects of that history, turning flesh into figures and human lives into numerical form. So Hamid's canvases return us to these archives in other ways too. They imitate patterns of 18th and 19th century textiles that were made in Manchester and transported across the world, attesting to the intimacies of trades and goods and people in which cotton was the currency of choice. And if you look, for example, at this work by the Italian artist Agostino Brunias, which is a really picturesque sort of scene of life on the island of Dominica, which Brunias created while he was there under the patronage of the island's first British governor, Sir William Young. This market scene of circulating, it shows a circulating economy of commodities, in particular textiles and black bodies, which position the Caribbean within what Sven Beckett has called a complex choreography of commerce, excuse me, charted by cotton, sugar, and enslaved people. These scenes reenact and echo a performance of market relations in which pieces of cotton cloth, originally made in India, became the unit of exchange for enslaved Africans. In fact, the word piece became a counting term for measuring the value of these enslaved men and women who were sold on the coast of West Africa. From as early as the 17th century, British and European manufacturers were producing cotton textiles that were often regarded by consumers as poor imitations of Indian-made fabrics for both domestic consumption and for the consumption and for the African trade. By the mid-19th century, Britain was exporting about 1/3 of its cotton cloth production, with 94% of all cotton cloth exports, including the checked and striped cloth as we see here, made expressly for Africa and the Americas. So Brunias's paintings of transactional interactions in a plantation economy vividly evoke these entanglements, the entanglements of these commercial networks. And when we put a painting like Brunias alongside a work like Hamid's, what we can start to see is how cotton not only connected different parts of the globe, but literally framed a mode of visualizing Black people by turning them into objects. And so for the rest of this talk, I want to return and explore in different ways this issue of viewership, of how cotton framed ways of seeing race and the implications of these ways of seeing. To do this, I'll return to number 25 and discuss the ways Drew's work plays with the relationship between surface and value. Then I'll expand this to consider the relationship of cotton cloth and representations of Blackness, And finally, I will consider the ramifications of this relationship between cotton and slavery in postbellum United States and beyond. So as I said in cotton.com, Hamid is using the framework of trade as a schema to plot the physical connections between the American South and Manchester, England. As she invokes the movement of cotton through a play between image and text, she also positions us in this space, asking us to speculatively recover these material effects from the abstraction of history. Drew's assemblages are, on the other hand, immobile and reflective, collapsing the space between the plantation and factory in other ways. To create this piece, Drew used sheets of unprocessed cotton, cut them by hand, and laid them into bales, bonding them with wax. In this way, his work mirrors the repetitive labor of cotton's cultivation, its production, and processing. Its physicality literally evokes the traces of a labor-intensive handwork that's inscribed into its own making. In its formation, then, Drew's work uses fragments to recall a host of bodily fictions revolving around the plantation, and in turn, these fragments script our interaction. So we need to come close to the work, engage with it on a multisensorial level, and through this repertoire of gestures, as performance studies scholar Diane Taylor highlights, we think through and call up the experiences, meanings, and bodies that may not or cannot otherwise be remembered. By scripting our interactions in this way, Drew's sculpture summons up histories of the plantation that do not simply return us to representation or the figure of the enslaved person. Instead, with its emphasis on the materiality of looking, this work returns us to the complicated conditions of viewership by which bodies of enslaved people were historically or are historically brought into view. So his sculptures are not immersive, but number 25 is absorbing. It requires us to physically participate in its unfolding of aesthetic experience. This is a surface both dynamic and static, a surface on which the gestures of art making, swirls and lines and strokes, accrete into a white wall. Yet its tactility also plays upon our physicality. We have to walk around it. The thick knots of cotton and straggly threads beg to be felt as they disrupt the surface. Our visual engagement is continually distracted by its changes from dull ivory and beige to moments of brilliant white. Its surface bulges as layers of cotton herniate and disrupt any attempt at smoothness. Its texture is uneven. It is both tightly compressed with wax while bursting at the seams. And so as we read the meaning of the art object through color, composition, etc., we also read the materiality of cotton itself. Ironically, I think in undertaking these, or in compelling us to undertake these formal considerations of the surface, there's a parallel here that is created between with what we are doing as viewers and with historical descriptions of classing cotton, in which traders and planters also carefully assessed the surface and the texture of cotton in their valuation. And so I think Drew's positioning of viewers in this instance has a really uncanny resemblance to the work of French artist Edgar Degas in this work, Portraits in a New Orleans Cotton Office, in which he's also invoking the relationships between cotton, art, and value. Now, Degas was facing severe financial hardship when he traveled to New Orleans, and he actually visited the city to see his brothers and uncle, who were all cotton merchants, and are included in this painting, but also because he hoped that he could make a painting that would sell for a high price to a cotton merchant in Manchester, in England. So here we stand as viewers with the figures at the back, sort of watching the events take place. Degas vividly brings to life the logic of market speculation here, registering as a visual process. He shows us a series of snapshots We see how speculation relies on a series of assessments, a literal visual accounting, to quote from Paul Stady, that he accentuates through the interaction of handwork and visual analysis taking place in the center and foreground. We see how these assessments are then translated from the real into the immaterial and become an abstraction of the physical in the intangibility of exchange, which is signaled in the accountant's ledgers and in Degas' younger brother René's perusing of the stock market in the newspaper. What the artist shows us then is the way commodities are bought and sold on the chance of a profit, the way an object's monetary value now is ascertained by what it will fetch on the market later. We can see this highlighted too in the ways his uncle, who's right in the center foreground, and the cotton traders are physically assessing the cotton, mirroring how the viewer must also assess the surface of a painting, and by extension, Degas' own work. Degas connecting the commodity forms of art and cotton in his painting about speculation. And so reading the meaning of an art object through color, composition, and texture, what I'm trying to highlight then is how we're also reading the materiality of cotton. And in their prolonged engagement with the surface of both these works, both these artists, I think, evoke really complex economics of vision in which they're connecting an artwork's aesthetic value with the market dynamics that underpin conditions of viewership. In looking at these artworks, we're also assessing the value of a commodity. And this viewing position has a particular resonance when considering the visual implications of Blackness in antebellum United States. Cotton was not simply the currency, the clothing, or the product for which enslaved people supplied labor. The body of the enslaved, a bale of cotton, and a piece of cotton cloth were all global commodities that underpin the political and social economy of the Atlantic world. The movement of enslaved Africans tracked that of cotton. First bought and sold in exchange for cotton cloth, they were shipped across the Atlantic, then bought and sold in relation to the price of cotton fiber. They were, in the United States, shipped along the Mississippi in ever-increasing numbers to ensure supplies of the commodity met demand. Or, as the African-American orator and intellectual Frederick Douglass reminded many of his audiences, when the value of cotton goes up, so does the value of a slave. So the absence of bodies and the abstraction of Drew's sculpture returns us then to the market connections between Blackness and white cotton that emerge from the institution of slavery, revealing what legal scholar Amy Robinson has argued is, I quote, the visual logic of commodity exchange, end quote. That is to say, this artwork materializes the fundamental economic process, which we see in Degas' painting too, whereby vision becomes a form of ascribing and assessing social or market value. Now, by turning to examine cotton's other form, cloth, I want to explain how this process of ascription and assessment was enacted on and through enslaved people themselves. In this next section, I'll be looking specifically at the ways cotton cloth materialized the value of enslaved people in the expanding economy of antebellum United States. So as you can see, in these samples, which are brownish and actually very rough to touch, these are samples of cloth known as quote unquote Negro cloth, and they're remnants of a trade in cotton that connected the agricultural South and the industrial North in the antebellum era. And actually, as you can see, they're found not far from you at Harvard. As raw cotton headed north, bales of Negro cloth, sometimes already fashioned into ready-made clothes, were sent south to plantations. These samples were attached to letters that connected planters, manufacturers, and their go-betweens. Their size allowed them to give prospective buyers a clear indicator of quality through a quick glance and a quick touch. By the 1830s, Negro cloth was one of the main factories of Rhode Island and Lowell, Massachusetts. The characteristics central to its production, its roughness, its cheapness, durability, and its plain weave were important to its use as clothing and reflected a range of sumptuary laws from the 17th century that prescribed the manner in which slave clothing should mark out distinctions between white and black. While its market value was dependent on the fluctuating price of both cotton fiber and enslaved labor, the use value of the cloth was correlated according to the labor of enslaved cotton pickers. So if it was too flimsy and it provided, if it was too flimsy, it provided ineffectual cover. If it was too thick, enslaved workers overheated. And in both these instances, productivity and profit slowed down. And in these letters, plantation owners expressed their concern about these issues. They expressed concerns about the quality, the transport, and the price of the cloth, which all reveal their awareness of this material relationship, their awareness of how the cloth had a direct effect on the labor of those it clothed. As the historian Walter Johnson has also pointed out, in plantation records, enslaved people were often described according to the labor they performed and the tools they used. So they were called, they were literally marked down in records as field hands or plows or hoes. And through their labor, what these records show is how through their labor, enslaved people were literally abstracted down to bodily parts. And I think in this type of cloth, inexpensive and functional, unattractive and uncomfortable, also reinforced this abstraction. It was worn, Negro cloth was worn to regulate labor. Its surface materialized the value of blackness as a usable commodity by identifying its wearer as a possession. In the context of the slave market, cloth also materialized the process of commodification. Or as Walter Johnson has described, cloth, and I quote, turned people into products. So cloth used in the slave auction looked very different to this type of cloth. As we saw in Brunius's painting, even before the 19th century, even before 19th century associations of color, pattern had begun to coalesce in relation to skin color. Emerging first from West African consumers' tastes, these associations between skin, between color, between style, converged with a growing body of literature about racial difference and took on social connotations. Across the Atlantic, the idea that Black Africans had a taste, that was the sort of language that was used for bright, or in the words of many writers, gaudy colors and bold prints, was increasingly a well-circulated idea in design manuals, sample books, and trade reports by the mid-19th century. And so this can perhaps explain why cloth used on the slave market did look so different to that rough, coarse cloth used on the plantation, because it was used specifically to draw attention to the individual attributes of people on sale. In the slave market, the aesthetic meanings of pattern and color were conflated with and made legible the commercial value of enslaved bodies. Now, planters' assessments of sales at auction was also an assessment of their potential, planters' assessments of enslaved people at auction was also an assessment of their potential to produce profit, a profit that was often marked in pounds of cotton. Planters speculated on cotton and on enslaved people, hoping their investments would provide good returns. They looked for physical attributes that would indicate this future profit. It was the Black female slave that historian Jennifer Morgan has argued was central to this idea of futurity, and that's her term, because she provided two forms of return, both reproductive and non-reproductive labor. And this libidinal economy is evocatively described, I think, in British artist Lefevre Cranston's painting. You'll notice here the detailed rendering of color, pattern, and cloth, which unfolds into a series of transactional relationships in which Black women are being bought, sold, and possibly undressed. These instances materialize the way fancy cloth, which is the term used for these kinds of cloth, not only framed a way of looking at blackness, but also instantiated different kinds of surface readings through which these Black people are read as an index of economic value. Coincidentally, too, these moments of speculation mirror the actions of traders and planters and factors, as we've already seen in Degas' painting, as they speculated on cotton's potential market value. For viewers of these kinds of slave auction paintings, and there weren't that many as a genre. For viewers of these paintings, particularly that of viewers of British artist Eyre Crowe, whose painting of a slave auction was possibly the only one to be displayed at the Royal Academy in London in 1861. I wonder if this visual logic of reading bodies would have been hard to miss. Not only are viewers positioned in similar locations to the buyers and the auctioneers, as viewers looked at the painting, and you can sort of imagine them, head angled to examine some aspect in more detail, conferring with each other, perhaps, they would have also mirrored the actions of the buyers. Crowe's depiction of this liminal space, the waiting room, might have presented a more palatable version of the trade than the spectacle of Cranston's auction block, but in positioning refined viewers of high art in correspondence with buyers of human flesh, he's also dramatically visualizing a viewing position that transforms observers into consumers, enmeshing them within a network of commerce, speculation, and colonialism underpinned by slavery. So in the midst of these moments of objectification, how did Black people find ways of expressing other forms of subjectivity? And this is something that we see in the poetry. This is a question that comes up in the poetry of New England factory girl Lucy Larcom, who uses the coarseness of Negro or Lowell cloth to address this. She worked in cotton factories in Lowell, Massachusetts, and in her poetry, or in some of her poems, she sees cotton as literally giving form to a web of work connecting Black and white women. In an idyll of work, she reflects, and I'm quoting, "When I've thought what soil the cotton plant we weave is rooted in, what waters it, the blood of souls in bondage, I felt that I was sinning against the light to stay and turn the accursed fiber into cloth." In Larcom's words, the cloth she weaves bears the material impressions of the physical touch of the Black women who pick the cotton. And it is their physical trace of labor, their sweat, their blood, perhaps their hair or skin, caught in the fibers that she uses to imagine the material networks incorporating her and these enslaved women within a larger framework of commercial production. So the idea that these pieces of cloth are sites of memory, to paraphrase Toni Morrison, is provocative, I think. And like Lubaina Hamid, I want to draw attention to these entanglements of cloth and flesh as a way of getting out from under these historical processes of elision, to find ways of materializing the complicated and pained experiences of enslaved people. And I say pained because it is the feel of cloth and the constraints of being clothed that are frequently mentioned in slave narratives, as well as in the compilation of oral histories by former slaves undertaken in the Federal Writers Project of the WPA from 1936 to 1938. So recalling her years as a slave in North Carolina, Harriet Jacobs writes, "I have a vivid recollection of the dress given me every winter by Mrs. Flint. How I hated it. It was one of the badges of slavery." Marked as property, these clothes marked bodies in other ways too. Annie Hawkins remembers, "Our dresses was made out of coarse cloth like sacking. it ought to be called Mulehide, for it was about that tough. Both Solomon Northrop and Frederick Douglass discuss the scanty qualities of the clothes they are given and their inability to protect them in their fieldwork. In the poor quality of the material, in the descriptions of being too hot in summer and too cold in winter, of laboring unprotected and heavy dresses and rough shirts, generic and uniform, we can also hear how bodies return again against these excoriations of cloth, refiguring how we might understand the experience of regulation encoded in slavery. I think these moments can also be read with other examples of actual redressing in the ways that enslaved workers fashioned themselves outside of regulation dress or reused European clothing for their own purposes, creating looks and styles that in plantation records and descriptions are often startling or confusing to the white viewers. I'm sorry. In these paintings too, I think we might also find other forms of relationality, the subtle expressions of a face, the touch between bodies, the establishment of connection that suggest how enslaved people expressed forms of kinship and held a clear understanding of their subjection of a life weighted down by, but lived despite these material conditions. There are moments here then that might resonate with theorist Fred Moten's description of enslaved people's resistance of the object and the ways they refused objectification that may not have been transformative, but were transgressive as Black people worked to continually revise this logic of valuation. So in making these readings, I've tried to draw out some of the implications around historical conditions of viewership and questions of value, reanimated by these contemporary artists' provocative use of cotton as commodity and the evocative tactility of their abstracted surfaces. In the context of antebellum United States, cotton and the value of Blackness were intimately connected via the market. This relationship framed the social meanings of Blackness such that enslaved people could be read or assessed as commodities. If we think back to these pairings of images where the act of looking is also an act of valuation, the price or value, what we see here is how the price or value of enslaved people and cotton is ultimately based on the future profits they will bring. This way of looking is what I would call a speculative vision, a vision based on future potential. I want to unpack this idea a little further in the context of postbellum United States. And I want to do that by beginning with an artist we all know, Winslow Homer, who painted The Cotton Pickers in 1876. And like Degas, Homer also wanted to sell this painting to a cotton merchant. But unlike Degas, he was successful in doing so. Degas' painting didn't sell the way he wanted. The work self-reflexively, I think, really raises concerns about the assessment and value of Homer's own artistic labors through the physical material of cotton. Here, through gestural swirls on the canvas, Homer's brush leaves a trace that connects his body and creativity to the finished product. But the artist seems to foreclose this possibility for his Black workers. These women's work, time-consuming, repetitive, and exhausting, seems to leave no mark at all. The value of their labor is lost amongst the swirling fibers of cotton, and they remain trapped, emancipated, perhaps, but not yet free. So in visually negotiating the material relations of a commodity that was itself market-driven, at the heart of both Degas and Homer's painting, I think, lies a question about the value and the meaning of labor in postbellum United States. That at least for Homer cannot be uncoupled from the Black body, in particular the Black female body. In making this association, Homer's melancholic painting references a growing market of images in which the labor of Black bodies signaled through the cotton they worked, was increasingly read as a sign of their fitness for freedom or proof of their potential to become useful, productive citizens. Now, although produced several years before Homer's painting, skipped ahead. This photograph illustrates my point. Produced in 1862 in Port Royal, which is one of the sea islands of the coast of South Carolina, the photograph shows a group of 7 African-American workers in front of a wooden building on a cotton plantation. Set in the turbulence of the American Civil War, but it shows a scene of transition. After coming under Union rule during the Civil War, many of Port Royal's white planters fled, leaving their former slaves behind. These Black people were termed contrabands of war, but these communities they numbered in the thousands, and they became the subject of what historians called a rehearsal for Reconstruction. So Northern missionaries and industrialists traveled to this district to assist in the transition from slavery to freedom. And in this transition, the cultivation of cotton was again understood to be a key way of acculturating formerly enslaved people into becoming productive American citizens. So in a sense, Port Royal was also an entirely speculative venture. And I think it's really fascinating that in this photograph, it is really from cotton that these Black women rise. Like, they're grounded in it, they're enmeshed and congealed with it. The cotton recalls, projects, and ultimately locates them in a changing national structure. Just as we see the cotton being processed on its way to a final product, so too are we able to, or are we encouraged to imagine these newly freed Black people on their way to becoming, but not yet, productive and profitable American subjects. Well, following the Civil War, this idea was reinforced through a panoply of photographs and stereographs of cotton-picking Black people, in which emancipation is continually revealed as a process, a literal transition from an object of exchange value to a subject with productive value. In these photographs and prints, Black bodies reenact a movement in time. They recreate a nostalgic past from the present. And in this sense, they were used like souvenirs. They were read as mementos of a lost time that continue to exist in the present. They provided viewers with a touristic guide to the South. And they usually came with travel narratives or captions that referred to popular novels or performances. And the arrangement of figures, the clothing, the abundance of cotton was often repeated in a similar configuration, again, reusing well-known tropes related to the antebellum plantation, which made these scenes and the people in them immediately recognizable and legible. They were a form, of time travel, I think. And in this sense, they provided viewers with a way to connect what they saw now in this period of Reconstruction with other earlier plantation narratives. So while these photographs might allow a reading that took viewers to the past, they also helped viewers look to the future by suturing the association of cotton and the free Black body into the evolving shape of the nation in postbellum United States. Again, then, through the market value of a commodity, the meaning of Blackness could now be read in relation to their labor, which existed as an indicator of their social value as citizens. Faced with the free but troubling Black body of the post-Civil War era, these images reinforce the status quo, but they also, as Jennifer Ray Greason has pointed out, symbolize the productive potential of the New South and, by extension, the nation. We see this then, I think, particularly in the ways both Homer and O'Sullivan return us to the Black female body, connecting her labor and her productivity to the productivity of the land, and of course, the productivity of the artist. These photographs and stereographs and Homer's painting as mobile circulating images really solidified the speculative nature of the Black body as a condition of its visibility. So even in freedom then, Blackness remained a form of the appearance of value. And in this new speculative economy of representation, Blackness becomes a sign of another kind of futurity, of value expressed or measured through what Saidiya Hartman has called the liberal ideology of the social contract and the appearance of the productive citizen. Being Black and free meant providing evidence of one's value as a productive citizen, a social value that was not given. So faced with a visual economy in which Black bodies must constantly be read as proof of their potential, we can understand the fraught nature of self-representation for Black artists and writers in the 19th century, especially. It's obviously a fraught endeavor today too. Not many African-American artists of the 19th century engage with the subject of cotton, although in the work of landscape painter Edward Mitchell Bannister, it does appear once and in a very ephemeral form. Bannister, as I'm sure many of you know, was born in Canada. He moved to Boston, and then to Providence in 1869, which was an area, as I highlighted earlier, shaped by the entangled relations of commerce and commodification of the cotton and the slave trade. In this unfinished study, The Mill, Knightsville, we might possibly be seeing a textile mill that had been part owned by one of his patrons. Here, Bannister's opening up a view of this smoking mill next to a waterway on which figures sail small boats. Our focus is on the two industrial buildings in the background, which are connected to the river by an almost naive rendering of smoke and hedges. Bannister's textured surface is suggestive. The river evokes a material and metaphorical conduit between this landscape and slavery's legacies in the South, links with which I began this talk. Furthermore, the layered and impressionistic brushwork, like Homer's cotton bowls, also gestures towards the substance of cotton, while also revealing Bannister's aesthetic modernity, a modernity reinforced by the harmonious relationship between industry and nature, leisure and labor, that could also be read as a sublimation of this other slave-related history. This sense of layering also reveals perhaps Bannister's own burdened position as an artist and a Black man in the United States in the late 19th century. His painting also raises another question about viewership that I think still is with us now. How do we see this history congealed within even the most generic American landscape without being framed, without continuing to see by its logic of vision and value? Returning to that history in the 20th century, other artists found other ways of reformatting the connection between vision and value. And I think in the work of self-taught artist Clementine Hunter, for example, paintings of cotton pickers and plantations are both memorials and artifacts that tell a history of Black life, labor, and love. Born on a plantation in New Orleans towards the end of the 19th century, Hunter draws on her personal memories to reframe cotton picking, and indeed cotton itself, as an emblem of both her community's earthly striving and a recollection of her own physical connection to place. Here, agricultural labor becomes a means of subsistence rather than the means of the accumulation of capital. Like Hunter, artists such as William H. Johnson and Romer Bearden also incorporated motifs of cotton and sharecropping in their work. Now, in his self-consciously naive style, Johnson's lyrical rendering emphasizes the strength and resilience of his workers, without idealizing the experience of labor itself. Based on his memories of his youth in South Carolina, Johnson's work was part of a broader effort in African American intellectual circles to excavate, document, and depict the authentic experience of rural and folk lives. And so here it's the dignity, not the drudgery, that we saw in Homer's painting, perhaps, of labor that Johnson evokes. It's a dignity that's reinforced by the cross-shaped tree trunk in the background, suggesting how work, family, and religion were the foundation of rural life for Black people. Romare Bearden's syncopated collage technique also reclaims the agricultural South as a site of Black community and innovation, but also a site of myth-making. His abstracted, dreamlike figures, while recalling the painful history of plantation slavery, defamiliarize it as a site of Black negation and elision. Created from quotidian materials and drawing on African-American artistic practices of quilt making, the collage might be thought of as a history painting that both memorializes and locates its aesthetic innovation in a history of Black resilience and cultural expression. The symbolism of cotton provides a way of materializing, not eliding Black subjecthood here. And to draw on the work of Jarvis McInnes, these artists' reclamation of labor emphasizes the use rather than exchange value of cotton. Cotton is not reduced to a commodity, but is also a thing or an object that can narrate other relationships between labor, land, and subjectivity. In visualizing this history from a different viewing position, all three of these artists making work during the years of segregation and the civil rights movement create frameworks for imagining or speculating on alternative futures in which the refigured relationship of race, place, and national identity are also established through new forms of aesthetic innovation and new ways of seeing. These new ways of seeing are also ways to reconstruct new forms of relation through which the measure of a person's value is radically transformed. Now, returning to the past to inform new ways of seeing, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, also underscores the process of Hank Willis Thomas. In this print, he has used a carborundum printing style to heighten the color and effect of this 1970s photograph, which was used on the record cover of an album by the Butterscotch Caboose for a song called Black Hands, White Cotton. Here, the light, soft, fluffy cotton ball is contrasted with lined, leathery hands imprinted by the lacerating work of picking cotton. While the crossed wrists recall images of the shackled limbs of enslaved people, there's also something seductive about the image. We follow lined rivulets along outstretched wrists. We notice the evanescence of the cotton, the lattice background of the cotton crop. There is something ornate and ornamented about the surface that recalls the format of advertising and commercial photographs. Like the cotton bowl, these works are, I think, a reminder of the way forms of objectification continue to be translated into a racialized gaze that restricts how certain bodies are read and the places they can be seen. Here, not only does the cotton picker remind us of the incomplete project of emancipation, the footballer reminds us of the continued ways that Black lives must generate their value to American society. Thomas's photographs, disturbingly alluring as they are, highlight what the geographer Catherine McKittrick has called plantation futures, essentially the after effects and legacies of anti-Black violence inculcated amidst the industrial economy of the plantation. We cannot, and Hank would not want us to either, look at these photographs without also considering the historical continuities between American slavery and the prison industrial complex. This image, for example, called The Cotton Pickers, was made between 1967 and 69 by Danny Lyon. It was the result of a 14-month project that took him to several penitentiaries in the Texas Department of Corrections. Here, a sea of cotton engulfs these prison laborers, while their horizon is the carceral state. Notice how the prison industrial complex has turned these men into what one of my students, Jamal Maddox, calls factors of production. They are virtually indistinguishable in their regimented uniforms, transformed into a ubiquitous resource like the cotton they pick. In the United States, we carry with us an image bank that complements, extends, and sometimes challenges the histories we know. As an art historian, my job is to constantly think about how these objects are shaped by the conditions of their production and how they exist beyond those conditions, by calling up a range of associations and investments in particular narratives or perspectives. I was given a glimpse of this again when a Princeton colleague first saw a picture of Drew's sculpture. The encroachment of the material fiber of the sculpture into the physical presence of a viewer was presently interpreted by my colleague as a form of suffocation. This artwork became for her a powerful symbol of the smothering history of racism that is embedded in the United States. Facing this blank wall of white cotton, even though mediated by a projector screen, she described the piece as a historical asphyxiation. For her, it materialized Eric Garner, and we could think, of course, of the more recent murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. For her, it materialized Eric Garner's gasping pleas as he struggled to break free from his murderer, saying, "I can't breathe." The struggle to break free from the chokehold of white supremacist terror that this work evoked for my Princeton colleague strikes me as a powerful, heartbreaking, and crucial component of why a material like cotton and its representation remains such an important visual symbol to detangle. Saturated with associations of race, slavery, exploitation, and terror, it also saturates our views of the past and the meanings we have made about whose lives matter. This is possibly why Drew refuses to include bodies in his work. Instead, he compels our bodies to actively participate in the unfolding of the artwork, through which the commodity of art and the commodity of cotton coalesce. The result is we are forced into a viewing position from which we must come to terms with our own process and processes of vision and valuation. Corey Menifee's act of smashing the stained glass window is the perfect metaphor then for what I think these artworks that I've discussed do. They show us how to disrupt, shatter, and radically transform the politics of vision that shapes the ways we see, we know, and we relate to each other. We just need to look. Thank you.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk and intervention. On behalf of all of the department, I just want to thank you for spending your morning with us. And I'm sure if we were all together, you would be greeted with rounds of applause and praise. Also to everyone, my name is Hampton Smith. I'm a first-year PhD student in the History, Theory, and Criticism department. And I also want to extend a quick but exuberant thanks to Jose Arguello, Indrani Saha, Aldante Winston, Kathleen Brearley, and Amanda Moore, as well as our wonderful technical team who really put together the work to make this broadcast possible. Before we begin, I want to encourage our listeners to start sending in their questions now. You can do that on either the webcast interface or on Facebook. But while we wait for questions to roll in, I wanted to kind of start by pulling your work into the present, and was wondering how you see this book and the kind of speculative vision that you demarcate around cotton as still at work with us today. And I'm thinking about fast fashion, the global supply chain, contemporary artists and fashion designers. I know you're kind of working on kind of a global plantation project, and was just wondering what your thoughts are there.
Thank you. And I just want to also quickly echo Hampton's thanks to everybody. I didn't mention everyone's name, but yeah, this has been an amazing team effort, and I'm really grateful to you all for having me on here today. Yeah, so I think I mean, I think as art historians, and particularly people like me who work with historical material, but also with contemporary, that there isn't really, I feel anyway, there isn't really a choice in terms of wanting your work to have a broader kind of connection or relation to the contemporary. So I see my work as very much about creating conversations between historical material and contemporary art, which is sort of how I've written the book. So each chapter opens with contemporary artists who have given me these frameworks. So in that sense, I think that's one way I'm thinking about it in the now. I think in terms of the subject matter, as you know, I think that what I've tried to show is that a material like cotton, had these symbolic meanings, and these kinds of meanings that it evoked about global trade and connection. We can still see those in the ways that fashion and commodities are described. I mean, I don't know if this was in Australia or the US, but there was this advertisement for a long time about cotton, the fabric that connects, and maybe, I'm not sure if that was something that that was a slogan in the US, but there's still a lot of we're still so caught up with this idea of these global connections and how things connect us and how we're all kind of part of this global world. But I'm always interested in how these contemporary expressions have a history and what that history can tell us. And I think what that history tells us is that these ways of thinking were also used to maintain kind of global scales of human exploitation, and so I think trying to highlight that as an ongoing condition of how we live, of how we consume, of what we wear, is really important. And I've been working with a couple of designers, and just sort of giving some talks about how fashion continues to have this, or how this history is still embedded in fashion. There's also some great work being done by textile designers that kind of highlight other kinds of cotton futures, which emphasize cotton's much longer history in West Africa and India, and the ways it was used by indigenous cultures. So there's some really interesting work, I think, being done in the area of fashion and textiles to kind of deconstruct some of these histories. And was there something else that you asked as well in that question?
I think that was a great response.
Okay, sorry.
We have a question from Professor Caroline Jones. As art historians, how do we balance the circumstances in which an image is seen with the formal contents of an image? Your rich talk sharpened this question, but I would love to hear more.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I mean, as I said, I'm trained in kind of in the 19th century, and so I'm always very much engaged with the work in its context, and the kind of historical and social landscape that a work emerges from. I think that's crucial, and that's also one of the things that people I worked with, like Jules Brown, highlighted, right? That the work is a kind of portal into this space. But of course, art objects are autonomous. They live on in different ways, and I think that's why working with contemporary art alongside historical objects has helped me so much, because I think there are ways that these historical objects can create new kinds of conversations with with newer artworks. And of course, contemporary artists are also creating those conversations back into the past. So that's how I've tried to negotiate those two different contexts, if you like.
Definitely. It's a exciting method to kind of think through the past alongside contemporary artists. And I think that's a really important thing for those of us that study the 18th and 19th century, and finding new voices for sure.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say too that the artists that I've worked with, they have sort of given me that framework. I think a lot of artists, like Lebena, Hank Willis Thomas, Titus Kaffar, they're involved in these kinds of conversations already. So,
right, definitely. So I know you mentioned this towards the kind of end of your presentation, but I'm curious about the gap between, I guess, the 19th century and the more contemporary moment. What can you kind of tell us about the intervening years and how this might manifest in what we call modern art? Would love to kind of hear you expound on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Originally, I wanted to have another chapter that kind of went into the 20th century, but you can't do it all. But anyway, so the really short segment discussion I gave on Clementine Hunter and Romare Bearden and William H. Johnson, that's sort of some of the direction that I'm starting to move into now. And I think in what I am interested in is how Black artists in the 20th century are reformatting this construction of cotton and reformatting the experience and construction of agricultural labor as a as a means to create, as I mentioned or quoted from Jarvis McInnes, as a way to highlight new relationships rather than as a way to reinforce the kind of exchange value of Blackness and commodities. So I've been reading also W.B. Du Bois, who after I'd finished the book, I found out he wrote a short story about cotton and life on the plantation. And then he's The Silver Fleece is, I think, the title. And he's also, in the 1950s, he gives a talk called Behold the Land, where it's given sort of in the context of, student organization in the South. And one of the things he talks about, or he highlights there, is that the South and agricultural labor is the site for a kind of global subaltern resistance and decolonial effort. And so I'm sort of using that to try and look at artists expand on the work that artists like Hunter and Johnson, Bearden, but also I'm also thinking about artists in the Caribbean who are also sort of reusing the plantation as in the context of calls for independence and decolonization, and also in Australia. So I guess this new work is also connected to my new project on the global plantation. So that's how I'm sort of thinking about it in the 20th century.
Kind of on that note, Lauren Jacoby asks, might you comment on the use of cotton in monetary currency?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't really talk about it that much in the book, but yes, of course it was used in the currency. It was used to make monetary currency. In the US Civil War too, it becomes really important in the production of currency in the US South, and as the South was also trying to kind of evade the blockade and continue trade with partners in Europe. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, it is, again, it's so fundamental to this logic of exchange. There is an artist who's working, and I can't remember his name now, but there's an artist who lives in I think in DC. I'll have to find his name and send it to you, Hampton. But he's working exactly on this and sort of using current copies of money, the money form, and has printed images of plantations, on them and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think that just reinforces the point that just how central this commodity was to these multiple modes of exchange. I mean, and also, the other thing that people often ask me to is cotton canvas, in terms of the centrality of cotton to art history, and the way that, again, we can bring these two sort of visual and economic logics together. But I tried really hard to find find out about cotton and canvases in the 19th century, and it turns out it wasn't really used until the 20th. So I wanted to go more into that with Degas and Homer, but that historical fact was not available to me at that time.
I'd love to know, as a first-year graduate student, where this project began. Was it an image or a text that really sparked this kind of whole project? I'd love to hear that kind of origin story, and I'm sure there's many, but.
How did it start? I think it started with my own experiences of movement, having grown up mostly in the former spaces of the former British Empire. I was always struck by how you could go anywhere and there'd be certain objects that kind of were familiar. And so I was thinking about, weirdly, I was thinking about the books that I grew up reading as a child in Sri Lanka, that children in Australia and the UK and West Africa would have also read, because they were circulated in various ways. And so I think it wasn't really an image, it was me trying to work out how, and so this is, what does that movement mean? Because again, it's a form of connection, but it's a form of connection that's created through the logic of colonialism. And so I think it was me trying to figure out how I could explore these concepts of movement and transformation that also engage with the actual material experience of holding these objects and their different, and how they changed in different contexts. So it was an idea more than an object.
I think kind of in this mobility or mobile moment, I think it's fair to say that your work connects otherwise disparate fields quite uniquely and importantly, that these fields that are usually kind of seen as existing somewhat separately, whether that's African diasporic and Black studies, American art, art of the British Empire, histories of capitalism, contemporary art. So what would you describe as your methodology, or what you're hoping that people might take away from this book as a methodology?
Yeah, someone else asked me this question once before, and I don't know if I came up with a reasonable answer, but I'll try. I think that I've always worked interdisciplinary. And so I think for me, my perspective, my intellectual formation is really through Black studies, I think, and African American studies. And I think that embedded in Black studies is an interdisciplinarity, and also is a viewpoint or an outlook that is, diasporic or transnational or even global, I think, in outlook, in ways that perhaps are not so clear in art history. And so you really, I think that's where how I've come to this way of working with images, and I think that would be my methodology. I'm also always, framed by theorists and writers like Stuart Hall, who, one of the things I always come back to with his work is this. He talks about, I don't know if you know it, but he has this great sort of description of tea in Britain, and he says, we are the outside history of that inside history of Britain. And so it's this kind of way of, I think, of looking that's always sort of looking sideways, or looking for that other kind of other story. And so I think in terms of art history, there's been more, because I don't know if my work is, I wouldn't call this book as a global art history, because it's transnational, but it is still very much about, it still deals a lot with colonial, forms of visuality, which I don't know if you could say that is truly global, or if you would want to. But there is more work, I think. I mean, it's certainly drawn from post-colonial, histories too, and post-colonial art histories. But I think there's more and more work being done on art history and migration, and writing art history, sort of drawing on migration studies and writing art histories as a form of encounter and kind of dialogue. And so I think that's probably how I would describe my methodology in kind of art historical terms. Yeah.
I think we have another question. There was a mention in the introduction of the relationship between race, history, and medicine. Can you speak about these connections between kind of history and medicine?
Oh, sure. Well, yeah. So I direct a project called Art HX, and that explores the entangled histories of race, colonial medicine, and visuality. And so for me, what I'm really interested in is how histories of medicine and histories of race were shaped each other. I'm interested in how art and visual and material objects, communicated those ideas, but also, as different technologies of representation and looking and visualizing emerge, how those different discourses were in conversation. And there's some really great work already being done on that. But for me, really, it's about how these histories continue to shape experiences of medicine today, and again, how certain people are valued over others in the medical industrial complex. This also again comes from my own experiences as a nurse, and seeing how where I was taught, and seeing how medicine kind of how that played out in hospital settings. So that, yeah, I'm just trying to think of some, and of course my brain has gone blank. But if you go to our website, it's www.artandcolonialmedicine.com. We have many bibliographies, but I think there's a lot of really interesting work now taking place on these intersections of medicine and art history, not just the ways of kind of representations of disease. There's some really interesting work also, obviously in the context of COVID, like the visualizing the ways that pandemics were visualized historically, and kind of using that to think about how we are seeing COVID today. There's a really also great new project called Visualizing the Virus that's sort of doing some of that history. And I think also a lot of these projects are also very much working through questions of care and how, so not just the kind of academic discourses, but how these have very real effects on people's bodies, on how people experience health, and how we can treat each other differently.
I think other questions are coming in, but they're being typed. So I guess I have another question. Within your research for this book project, did you run into any enslaved Black makers of crafts or of utilitarian goods? I'm just curious. I know I've ran into some in my own research in terms of seamstresses and things of that nature, but was just wondering.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't run into people who were named, but yes, I mean there were images, and I would love to hear more about what you've run into actually. Yeah, there are always descriptions of seamstresses, and it was usually, I think I came across Black women who seamstresses, and also sometimes the cloth was made, the entire production process was made on the plantation. So there were some images or descriptions of enslaved men and women actually processing the cotton, weaving it, putting it, spinning it, and then also in slave advertisements, I came across descriptions of enslaved people who were either wanted for their skills or who had those skills. There are Lydia Hart, I think is her name. She's written about a lot of enslaved textile workers, and so there are actually named women who were seamstresses, but they were often not on the plantation. So yeah, but yeah, I'd love to hear about the people that you've come across too. That sounds great and really important research.
Yeah, thank you. Final question. You spoke about the pattern clothing as being kind of specifically designed for the auction block. Were those clothes the property of the enslaved individuals, or did they belong to the slave owners? Meaning, did the clothes go with the enslaved person when sold?
No, that's a great question. They were often the property of the sort of network of what do you call them? Of the what's the word? Oh, the slave markets had this sort of network of people who worked in and around them, and so people could buy or hire the clothes out from there. So they were like traders in fancy cloth and things like that. So enslaved people would have the clothes on for during the auction, and then often I think they went back. So they presumably then they were dressed in the kind of in the sort of drab clothes sent back. But Walter Johnson has a really great chapter on this kind of on the slave market essentially, because there were people who would hire out jewelry, they would hire out clothing, And also Maury McInnes has written more about that as well. So yeah, so no, they weren't usually the property of the enslaved person after they were sold.
Well, I think we are about at time, but I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us and answering questions. I also wanted to thank everyone here for coming this evening. We hope you will join us next week for the last lecture of this season. On Thursday, May 20th at 6 p.m., we will host Hawaii Nonlinear, a research studio conversation with Chris Leong, Dominic Leong, Sean Connolly, and students from the department. You can see details at architecture.mit.edu. I also just wanted to pub really quickly Anna's book, Black Bodies, White Gold, on the Duke University Press website. And we hope to see you all with us again. Bye.
Thank you.